it seemed to be like you're either, you know, this Beatles fan or a Stones fan, like never the twain would meet. Bullshit, you know, I mean, we are so similar, it's not true. And we all recognize that, and that was one of the great things about it. I mean, between the two bands, there was never any sense of, you know, competition. It was like cooperation.
When a man like Keith Richards speaks, it isn't gossip, it's gospel. His words carry the weight of half a century spent in smoky studios, thunderous stages, and nights that blurred into music history. There's a rare kind of honesty that comes from surviving the rise and ruin of rock and roll, and at 81, Keith has no patience left for politeness. "I've seen the best, and I've seen the pretenders," he once muttered. "You can tell who's playing from the heart, and who's just chasing applause." Born in 1943 in Dartford, England, Richards built his legend not on image but instinct. He lived through every era that tried to reinvent the guitar, and outlasted most of them. From the raw pulse of Chicago blues to the swagger of British rock, he carved his truth in distortion and defiance. So when Keith finally decided to name the 10 bands he despised the most, it wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Because for Keith Richards, love and contempt spring from the same place, the relentless demand for real music. So when Keith finally sat down and named the 10 bands he despised, the list wasn't born of jealousy. It was a reckoning. He'd spent a lifetime watching rock lose its teeth, its dirt, its danger. These weren't random dislikes. They were warnings from a man who'd seen what happens when sound turns into spectacle. 1. Pink Floyd. David Gilmour's precision versus Keith's chaos. It startled many to learn Keith never cared for Pink Floyd. He once laughed, "They're technically brilliant, but music isn't a math class." For him, David Gilmour's soaring precision represented everything rock risked becoming, beautiful, yet bloodless. Gilmour painted galaxies in tone. Keith lived in alleyways of rhythm. Still, he couldn't deny the man's command of space. Those long, aching bends that seemed to pause time itself. What Keith despised wasn't Gilmour's artistry, but the detachment, the idea that perfection could replace sweat. When you clean music up too much, he'd say, you wash the soul right out of it. Ironically, Gilmour once called Keith's riffs messy poetry, a backhanded compliment that perfectly summed up their divide, order versus instinct, architecture versus pulse. 2. Prince, the Purple Showman. Of all the names, none caused more argument than Prince. Keith respected his talent. A hell of a guitarist, he admitted, but hated the glitter. To him, Prince symbolized the moment rock became theater, when groove got replaced by glamour. "All style, no blues," he scoffed once. Yet beneath that jab was envy of a different kind. Prince could play everything Keith loved, but wrapped it in velvet and neon instead of denim and cigarette smoke. Keith had clawed his way through decades where authenticity was earned note by note. Prince appeared like a comet, self-contained, flawless, untouchable. Still, as years passed, he softened. Watching Prince's While. "My guitar gently weeps solo at the Rock Hall tribute," he whispered. That boy had church in his fingers. Even in disdain, there was recognition. Because when Keith saw someone bend a note until it cried, he saw a reflection of his own ghosts. 3. Eric Clapton, friend, rival, mirror. To outsiders, Keith and Clapton were brothers of the blues, but behind the smiles lived friction. They were two men shaped by the same roots yet divided by temperament. Clapton sought purity, Keith chased danger. "Eric's the teacher's pet of the blues," he joked. "I was the kid smoking behind the shed." Their friendship stretched back to London's smoky clubs, but Keith always bristled at Clapton's meticulous tone, his polished phrasing. Where Keith thrived on imperfection, Clapton practiced restraint. Still, he envied the elegance. "Slowhand could make a note weep like a widow," he once said, but admiration didn't erase irritation, especially as Clapton drifted into soft rock safety. He forgot the dirt, Keith grumbled in the late 80s. And the blues were born in dirt. Yet, when Clapton lost his son and poured his grief into tears in heaven, Keith wept privately. In that fragile melody, he heard the heart he thought Eric had buried. Maybe, he conceded later, We all find the blues again when life breaks us. Through these early names, one pattern becomes clear. Keith's contempt was never cruel. It was the sound of a man defending what he believed music should feel like. Each band or artist represented a choice the industry made. Polish over pulse, image over instinct. And though his words could sting, his motive was devotion. To keep the fire of imperfection alive. Because to Keith Richards, rock and roll wasn't meant to be flawless. It was meant to be true. 4. Mark Knopfler, the clean hands of dire straits. Keith once called Mark Knopfler a surgeon with a guitar. He meant it as both compliment and complaint. To him, Knopfler's playing was too clean, too careful. The way his fingers picked those glassy notes on Sultans of Swing was, in Keith's eyes, the opposite of what blues should be. Messy, human, unpredictable. But Keith respected his discipline. He knew Knopfler came from the same school of tone and storytelling, yet walked a more refined path. Mark never broke a string, never broke a sweat. Keith laughed. I broke both by the first chorus. Still, in quieter moments, he admitted he envied Knopfler's calm. That ability to make restraint sound like rebellion. Their difference wasn't in heart, but in temperature. Knopfler burned cool, Richards burned wild. And when Keith watched Mark's solo on Brothers in Arms, even he had to nod. That, he murmured, is what sadness sounds like when it's too proud to cry. 5. Gary Moore, the fire without the fray. Gary Moore's name came with sparks, his tone blistering, his passion undeniable, but for Keith, Moore represented a kind of modern excess that left him cold. The man could play circles around me, he once admitted, but it's not a race, is it? Keith distrusted speed. He believed every extra note risked losing the truth beneath. Where Moore unleashed cascades of lightning, Keith preferred thunder, slower, heavier, lasting longer in the gut. Yet he couldn't ignore the soul behind the noise. Watching Moore's Parisian Walkways live, he whispered, "He plays like a man who's bleeding." It wasn't hate, it was fatigue. To Keith, the younger generation's obsession with proving skill had killed the magic of listening. "You don't have to play louder to be heard," he once told a reporter. "You just have to mean it." Gary Moore, for all his intensity, reminded Keith how rare it had become to find silence between the notes. 6. Stevie Ray Vaughan, the prodigy of pain. This one hurt him to admit. Stevie Ray Vaughan was adored by everyone who ever touched a guitar, Keith included. And yet, he still bristled. He was too good too soon, Keith sighed once. He didn't have to fight for it like we did. To Keith, the blues were earned in smoky bars and cheap whiskey, not studio perfection. Stevie's tone was immaculate, his timing otherworldly. "It's like watching God warm up," Keith joked, but beneath the jest was reverence and a touch of resentment. When Vaughan died at 35, Keith felt both grief and guilt. "I wanted to see what he'd sound like broken," he said softly. That's when you really find out who you are. In truth, Vaughan had already found it, that rare balance between fire and finesse. And Keith, the eternal outlaw, recognized something frightening in him, the possibility that purity and danger could live in the same riff. 7. Peter Green, the ghost. He could never outrun. If Keith's disdain ever bordered on envy, it was with Peter Green, the haunted genius behind early Fleetwood Mac. Peter had what most of us faked, Keith confessed. The blues were eating him alive. Their paths crossed in London's late 60s clubs, where Peter's Les Paul could make grown men stare in silence. Keith admired him deeply, but feared what he represented, the cost of sincerity. Peter played like he was confessing sins, he said, and maybe that's why he couldn't stay. When Green vanished from fame, retreating into obscurity, Keith saw a reflection of the darkness he'd skirted his whole life. "Some of us drink to forget," he once admitted. Peter forgot by disappearing. His so-called despising was never about hatred. It was fear cloaked as critique, because Green reminded him that genius and madness share the same chord. Through these stories, Keith's list feels less like a catalog of hatred and more like a confession, a portrait of an artist measuring his own soul against others. Every name reveals a fragment of his code: authenticity over fame, struggle over shine, feel over form. What he despised wasn't people, it was pretense. And in a world that polished rebellion into a product, Keith Richards stood as one of the last men still carrying dirt under his nails. 8. Ritchie Blackmore, the virtuoso. He never understood. Keith and Ritchie Blackmore were opposites in nearly every way. Blackmore treated music like combat, every note sharp, every solo a duel. Keith, on the other hand, played like he was telling a secret through a broken speaker. Ritchie's brilliant, Keith once said, but he plays to win, I play to feel. When Deep Purple hit their stride, Keith admired the power but despised the showmanship, the cape, the drama, the self-seriousness. If you need fireworks to sell a riff, maybe the riff isn't good enough, he quipped. Yet, watching Blackmore's Child in Time solo years later, he paused. That's fury made beautiful. It wasn't hatred anymore. It was awe with a hint of regret. Regret that two men who spoke the same musical language had never shared a single stage. 9. The Eagles, the sound of safety. Few bands triggered Keith's scorn like the Eagles. To him, they were the perfect symbol of what rock became once it moved into boardrooms. Beautiful harmonies, he sneered, but you can't smell the whiskey. He thought they sanitized rebellion, turned rough edges into radio polish. They made the desert sound like a hotel lobby, he once joked, and yet, when Hotel California echoed through an old bar years later, he didn't turn it off. He just sighed. They did what we couldn't. They made rock behave. Beneath the sarcasm was a reluctant respect. He knew the Eagles wrote with precision and purpose, but he still missed the chaos that once made the genre dangerous. For Keith, music wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to bruise you a little. 10. Coldplay, the modern mirage. Keith's list ended not with a peer, but a warning, Coldplay. To him, they embodied everything that had gone wrong with modern rock. It's wallpaper music, he said in one interview. Nice colors, no cracks. He didn't hate them as people. He hated what they represented, the death of danger, the triumph of comfort. When asked why he was so harsh, he shrugged. It's not their fault. The world changed. People stopped wanting to feel uncomfortable. For someone who built a career making the world dance to imperfection, that was heartbreak. Yet, even in critique, he offered advice. If you're going to play it safe, you might as well not play at all. When you look at the 10 names together, you don't see a bitter old rocker. You see a man fighting for the pulse of music itself. Every artist he despised reflected a fear. That emotion would be replaced by effect, that the blues would be forgotten beneath machines and money. Keith's contempt was a kind of love letter to imperfection, to cracked amps, missed beats, and the human heart behind every chord. For him, real music was never about sounding good. It was about sounding alive. Today at 81, Keith Richards still wakes up, picks up his guitar, and plays the same open G chord that started it all. His hands shake a little more, but the rhythm, that ancient defiant rhythm, never left him. Asked once if he still hated those bands, he laughed. Nah, I've made peace. Hate's just love that got tired. And that's the truth of Keith Richards, a man who's seen the whole arc of rock, from the muddy clubs of London to the polished stages of Las Vegas, and still believes in the power of noise that means something. His honesty reminds us that rebellion doesn't retire. It just tunes down a step. Rock and roll isn't supposed to be polite. The minute it is, it's dead. Keith Richards.